century ago, 7 young men founded a brotherhood committed to the cause of freedom. Today, over 125,000 members strong, the Brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha continue this fight. W.E.B. Du Bois, Jesse Owens, Duke Ellington, Edward Brooke, Thurgood Marshall, Andrew Young, and Martin Luther King Jr. are among the countless Alpha men who have dedicated their lives to scholarship, manly deeds, and love for all mankind. The history of these men is the history of America, and their place in the vanguard of African American progress is unparalleled. This is the story of Alpha Phi Alpha's century of leadership. Alpha Phi Alpha, A Century of Leadership, is made possible by major funding from Al-America Bank. May 1896. The news from Washington, D.C. stunned African American communities across the United States. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, a challenge to the practice of segregating railroad passengers, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution permitted segregation of black and white Americans. Just 30 years after emancipation, the decision was a new low point for African Americans post-Reconstruction, as Jim Crow took an even stronger grip on the nation.
It was a signal to all the states that had wrestled with the problem of desegregation that that was no longer a problem, that they could separate the races and maintain, quote, equality, unquote, which of course meant inequality. There were no examples that I can find that there was any conscientious effort at all to maintain equality in a separate society.
The Plessy decision further complicated a growing debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois regarding the proper strategy to improve conditions for all African Americans. A year before the Supreme Court's Plessy decision, Washington gave his famous Atlanta Exposition address, suggesting a program of social and political conciliation until economic security was established and maintained. W.E.B. Du Bois countered Washington's position, calling for an organized determination and aggressive action on the part of men who believe in Negro freedom and growth. In 1905, 29 men from 14 states answered Du Bois' call, meeting on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls.
Going to meet in Buffalo, New York, but they couldn't find housing because of this doctrine of separate but equal, a place where they could hold their meeting. So they went to the Canadian side of Niagara Falls, and this is why it's called the Niagara Movement in 1905. And one of the things that W.E.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, and others who were part of the Niagara Movement wanted to demonstrate to the country was that African Americans were not satisfied with their situation, that things had to change. And so they formed the Niagara Movement. They issued a Declaration of Principles. Now, that Declaration of Principles indicates the rights that African Americans desire, as well as the responsibilities that African Americans themselves needed to embrace in order to change the situation in the country. And the founders of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity were very much influenced by the Niagara Movement.
On the main gateway of Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, are the words of university founder Ezra Cornell. I would found an institution where any person can find instruction in any study. With this guiding principle, Cornell was among the few mainly white universities at the time accepting African Americans pursuing higher education.
Well, Cornell attracted many African Americans because it was a unique university in those days. It had many brilliant scholars, and many African Americans have been drawn to it as a very liberal university. The atmosphere is such that many young men in the South who were going north for education went to Cornell, just as they went to Harvard and Yale and Princeton.
African American students at Cornell at the time lived in the Ithaca community. The Ithaca community has an old, established African American population. Many of these individuals worked at the university. They were the individuals who helped to clean the university, who helped to maintain the university, clean the dorm rooms. They were the cooks for the university and that sort of thing. But the students lived in the African American community. Most of them lived around St. James AME Zion Church, the oldest extant church building in Ithaca was built in 1837. Ithaca was a station on the Underground Railroad. A number of individuals who were escaping from slavery before the Civil War, of course, settled in Ithaca, New York. Harriet Tubman visited Ithaca, New York. Frederick Douglass spoke in Ithaca, New York. So you have a bit of a heritage there in Ithaca, and I think they became a part of this.
Within this historic African American community, a small group of students at Cornell, inspired by the Niagara Movement's Declaration of Principles, began a journey that continues even now, 100 years later. Among these exceptional young men was Henry Arthur Callis, son of an AME Zion preacher in Binghamton, New York. Callis fulfilled his childhood pledge by enrolling at Cornell to prepare for a career in medicine. He supported himself by waiting tables at one of the white fraternities which dominated campus social life, and was known to remove his waiter's jacket and tutor white fraternity boys for $5 a lesson. Callis impressed fellow students with his passion and fervor for African American advancement.
Callis was influenced by some of the great social activist persons of that time, Harriet Tubman, the great abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, who was a distant cousin of Callis by marriage. He, as a young man, would learn and recite the speeches of Douglass. There's an account of him reciting the Atlanta Exposition speaker Booker T. Washington in 1895, and even being called Little Booker T because of his zest in giving that great oration.
Charles Henry Chapman grew up near Ithaca, returning to Cornell after attending Howard University Academy. In addition to studying agriculture full-time, Chapman was a successful businessman.
He owned a small brickyard and even a little small cafe. Many of us like to say that he was one of the founders that had some modest means, which we see instrumental as the organization began to take shape.
Eugene Kinkle Jones was a son of two highly educated African-American parents, an unusual circumstance at that time. Jones' father was a professor at Virginia Union University. His mother earned degrees from a music conservatory in Boston and from Howard University. Jones left Richmond to study at Cornell in the fall of 1906. George Biddle Kelly came from Troy, New York. His great-uncle served in the historic Boston, Massachusetts 54th Infantry during the Civil War. Kelly often recounted his great-uncle and grandfather's stories of slavery and of the great fight for freedom. Born in Washington, D.C., Nathaniel Allison Murray was the son of Daniel Alexander Payne Murray, the first African-American employee of the Library of Congress, credited with facilitating the earliest collection of American history told by African Americans. Ancestors on Murray's mother's side fought in the Revolutionary War and stood with John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Robert Harold Ogle, son of Ellen and Jeremiah, a day laborer, was also from Washington, D.C. Ogle rented a room in Archie and Annie Singleton's house in Ithaca in 1905, and was the only one in this group of young men who was married with children while still a student. Upon the tragic death of his wife, Ogle persevered as a widower with 2 daughters in his senior year at Cornell.
He worked at the Ithaca Hotel. He also had a job as a porter on the railroad during the summer, and just had some great obstacles, yet he graduated.
Vertner Woodson Tandy was born in Lexington, Kentucky. His father, Henry, was a successful and well-known building contractor. Tandy transferred to Cornell from Tuskegee Normal School, where he played in the cadets band and studied architecture. Referred to by his friends at Cornell as an ardent devotee at the shrine of Bacchus and Aphrodite, Tandy was known to take unannounced excursions from school for entertainment. These 7 young men were part of a group of African-American students who supported each other academically and socially to survive in this difficult environment. Though Cornell accepted black students, they remained segregated from their white counterparts. Outside the classroom, there was no social interaction between the races in sports, study, or Greek life. There was a high attrition rate among African-American students in such challenging surroundings.
So they lived in a little, sort of a little cell of their own. And this is what caused them so much anguish and so much anxiety and so much a sense of separation and of detachment. So that's the climate in which they lived, and that's the reason for them to try to band themselves together.
The man that brought these founders together was a gentleman by the name of Charles Poindexter, and he initiated social affairs, Friday evening socials, where they would gather at the homes of persons there.
Charles Cordoza Poindexter hailed from West Virginia, attending graduate school at Cornell after graduating from Ohio State University.
This was C.C. Poindexter's idea in starting a social study club. And through the social study club, individuals would gain support, would be able to prosper academically.
At a meeting on October 23, 1906, George Biddle Kelly moved and it was approved that the society be known by the Greek letters Alpha Phi Alpha. Having worked in white fraternity houses and seen the camaraderie and support provided by the Greek letter societies, some attendees at this meeting, including James H. Morton, discussed the possibility of becoming a fraternity. They hoped such an organization would improve conditions for future African-American students at Cornell. C.C. Poindexter strongly objected to this proposal.
He did not support the idea of a fraternity because, again, he saw the fraternities that were on the campus. He saw the frivolity, the frivolousness, if you will, of many of these organizations. And I think for him, he did not feel that the black community could afford having such an organization.
At a meeting on December 4, 1906, C.C. Poindexter surprised the group with his official resignation. After vigorous debate of his views, a vote was taken. Poindexter's resignation was regretfully accepted, and the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity was born.
The founders of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity were not looking to start a traditional social organization. They were looking to start an organization that had a social purpose, that had an intellectual purpose, that would be involved in activities beyond the college campus.
They sought from the very beginning to emphasize, first of all, scholarship. Secondly, manly deeds, as they later said in that in the hymn, and a love for all mankind. They wanted social programs and educational programs that transcended the kind of strict society in which they lived. It also, of course, suggested to them that they ought to look beyond their communities, restricted as their communities were, and become a part of the larger social media society, which of course meant that they wanted to attack some of the problems that beset their fellows.
The founders of Alpha Phi Alpha were not familiar with the workings of college Greek letter societies. Through observations while working at white fraternities and their own wisdom, they fashioned an organization to meet their needs. The fraternity later adopted the motto, "First of all, servants of all, we shall transcend all," and the ancient symbol of the Sphinx representing intellect and strength, as well as the members' African ancestry. Suggested by Henry Arthur Callis, the aim to destroy all prejudice was included in the General Constitution of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. These founders could not know what the future held, but they were armed with formidable intellectual and spiritual capacities and driven by a noble purpose. As word of Alpha Phi Alpha's founding at Cornell reached other college campuses, a desire ignited to join in this remarkable endeavor. Traveling home from the Christmas holiday of 1907, Eugene Kinkle Jones and Nathaniel Allison Murray stopped in Washington, D.C. to establish a second Alpha chapter at Howard University. On December 20th, 19 young men were inducted into Alpha Phi Alpha's Beta chapter. 10 days later, Jones conducted a similar ceremony at Virginia Union College in Richmond, creating the fraternity's Gamma chapter. He recalled that these days ended with every man proud that he belonged to an organization of noble purpose and fraternalism.
I often like to say that it was Jones who spread the gospel of Alpha. He had caught fire of the Alpha spirit because, you know, in order for Alpha to grow, it had to expand. You know, and he took the idea and the concepts and the precepts of this very young organization within a matter of months after his initiation and began to plant seeds at other college campuses. And, of course, those seeds germinated, and today we have over 700 college chapters, 700 chapters, college and alumni throughout the United States.
With the fraternity's expansion, the need for a national meeting emerged. In December 1908, Alpha Phi Alpha held its first general convention on the 4th floor of the main building of Howard University campus.
And there the first general convention was held, and a constitution and bylaws were drafted, and conditions were set for the expansion of the fraternity.
On the closing day of the convention, the election of Moses Alvin Morrison of Beta Chapter as national president officially transferred control of the fraternity from Cornell University, and Alpha Phi Alpha became the first national intercollegiate fraternity for African American men. Alpha's birth came at a time when violence against African Americans was on the rise in the United States. 4 months before the 1908 convention, a race riot tore apart Springfield, Illinois. This aggression, taking place with bitter irony in the town of Abraham Lincoln's tomb, terrified black communities across the country.
And this really struck a number of people around the country. How could this happen? About 4,000 African Americans are expelled from Springfield, Illinois. They have to leave the town. And so a number of people are struck by this, and this leads to the formation of the NAACP.
In what was known as the Second Niagara Movement, W.E.B. Du Bois called a meeting at Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, where the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was founded. This group shared many of the objectives of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity.
Therefore, they tended to support the program, the views and the program of the NAACP more than the so-called patient and long-suffering attitude that Booker T. Washington and his group advocated. So there was a coincidence of feeling and of program and of activity on the part of Alphas on the one hand and the NAACP on the other. Small wonder that the founding fathers of the NAACP found that the Alphas were an organization to their liking, and many of them joined the Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity.
W.E.B. Du Bois himself was among the NAACP founders who became brothers of Alpha Phi Alpha, joining the fraternity in 1909. Alpha Phi Alpha supported other African American organizations emerging in the early decades of the 20th century, including the National Urban League. Alpha Phi Alpha founder Eugene Kinkle Jones became the executive secretary of this organization in 1917, and throughout the National Urban League's nearly 100 years of existence, Alpha men have played a critical role in the organization.
You know, the most humbling part of this is that one of the founders of Alpha Phi Alpha, Eugene Kinkle Jones, was what was then called the executive secretary of the National Urban League, really the president and CEO in the 1920s and in the 1930s. So it's humbling for me many years later, 80 years later, to have an opportunity to stand on his shoulders as the new president, as the current president and CEO of the National Urban League. And to also note, and I don't think it's a coincidence, that the National Urban League has had 8 leaders in 95 years. And of those 8 leaders, 6 have been members of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity.
Alpha brothers who have served as chief executive of the National Urban League include Eugene Kinkle Jones, Lester Granger, Channing Tobias, Whitney M. Young Jr., Hugh B. Price, and Mark Morial. The rapid growth of civil rights organizations also fueled Alpha Phi Alpha's development. New chapters formed across the country, and the fraternity soon took an innovative step forward in its evolution.
And early on, there was a desire to continue the bonds of college days in a more formal way, and to bring into the fraternity others who did not have the opportunity for the fraternal experience, either because they did not attend the university where there was a fraternity, or because they chose to delay it for some reason.
In 1911, Alpha Phi Alpha transformed the traditional understanding of a fraternity as an organization only for those in college, with the creation of the first alumni chapter, Alpha Lambda, in Louisville, Kentucky.
At this time, other than the church, what are the outlets for black men? There are very few professional organizations that are in existence at this time. So black men who are professionals, who are college graduates, are able to fellowship within the fraternity in ways that they're not able to fellowship in the larger society. So the fraternity meets that particular need at the graduate level.
With the expansion of undergraduate and alumni chapters, a means of regular communication between the groups became necessary. The solution was the Sphinx magazine, first published in March 1914 with future Alpha General President Raymond W. Cannon as editor. Many early Sphinx editorials addressed the importance of keeping alumni brothers loyal and involved in the fraternity. The Sphinx is the second oldest African American publication still in existence today. Americans hoped that World War I, the war to end all wars, would establish equality and justice around the globe. Many Alpha men enlisted, convinced that victory in this war would forever change the way Americans viewed equality at home. Alpha's Beta chapter and others at Howard University successfully lobbied the U.S. government to establish a camp for training black military officers. The largest group represented at this camp, located at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, was the 58 Alphas present, and 50 of these men received commissions. Though pleased with their successes, Alpha brothers were frustrated with the segregated military, remaining firmly committed to combat any and all obstacles to African American progress. America emerged from World War I and entered the 1920s with a roar. The Harlem Renaissance of this era was pivotal in the cultural history of the United States, as African American artistic achievement gained greater currency. Naturally, many Alpha brothers participated in this movement, men such as historian and essayist Charles H. Wesley, the talented writer Countee Cullen, songwriter Noble Sissle, Opportunity magazine editor Charles Johnson, the multi-talented Paul Robeson, and the legendary Duke Ellington were important figures in the Harlem Renaissance.
One of my Alpha brothers that I absolutely admire is Duke Ellington. Because, remember now, he was the one that opened the door. These were the door openers, if you will. I merely just walked through and received the benefits of many a day of their hard work and labor. But it was, not only were they ambassadors of the music, but they were also the ambassadors of the community.
12th General President Raymond W. Cannon recalled that at the height of the Harlem Renaissance, Alpha was shocked to learn of the dismally low high school graduation rate among African American students. As Alpha believed in the fundamental importance of education for African American progress, the fraternity initiated a Go to High School, Go to College program in 1919.
And they established this program, go to high school, go to college. I mean, get an education, that's the point. Those of you who can go to college, go to college. But most of you can get at least a high school education. You're going to need that if you're going to succeed in this world. And the chapters embraced it as a national program. It was really our first big national program.
We were out telling people, go to high school, go to college. Stay in high school, graduate from high school, and then go to college. We sent members of our different chapters around the country into the high schools of this country to tell the youngsters. We were assembly speakers, and we sent flyers out into the community. We talked with the principal. We want them to go to high school, go to college.
By the end of the 1920s, Alpha Phi Alpha was proud of its accomplishments and had grown from one small chapter at Cornell University to 85 chapters at institutions across the country with over 3,000 members. The fraternity continued to hold national meetings annually in major cities and at black universities around the country. In 1926, General President Raymond W. Cannon chose the eminent historian and Alpha brother Charles Harris Wesley to write a comprehensive history of the fraternity. At the 1929 convention in Atlanta, Wesley presented the first copies of the Alpha Phi Alpha history book. The 294-page volume gave the first account of Alpha's activities from the Jewels at Cornell in 1905 through the fraternity's extensive work of 1928. During this convention, the Alpha brothers made a pilgrimage to the Tuskegee Institute, considered a model African American community, with elementary and high schools, housing, and a bank all on the grounds. The Alpha Conventioneers paid tribute at the tomb of Booker T. Washington. Clearly, Alpha had a great appreciation of Washington's contribution to African American development, despite the fraternity's close association with W.E.B. Du Bois. The men of Alpha knew that unity of purpose, regardless of differences in approach, was vital to the success in the struggles that lay ahead. Just as Alpha Phi Alpha sought to expand further, America was hit by the Great Depression. The Depression was hard on the entire country, but especially African Americans.
The black community feels the Depression sooner and it lasts longer than for the rest of the country, and this certainly affects the fraternity.
In December 1930, the fraternity's executive council reported that 17 chapters were inactive, yet Alpha endured.
The existence of our alumni chapters was one of the things that helped to sustain us as there was some decline in membership on college campuses because of fewer African Americans being able to afford to go to college at that time.
But the men of Alpha persisted in their leadership and service. Their undying commitment was aptly described by Brother Bernard Young, editor of the Sphinx magazine. Any brother who has fraternity spirit and love worthy of the name, we see that old man Depression gets a licking from Alpha Phi Alpha. In 1933, the fraternity established the Alpha Phi Alpha Education Foundation. Headed by Brother Rayford W. Logan, the Education Foundation comprised a structure of scholarships and grants for African American students. In addition, they created Foundation Publishing to provide financial support and fellowship for writers addressing African American issues. A young John Hope Franklin was among the first recipients of assistance from Foundation Publishing. Additionally, a committee of public policy was organized to give Alpha a voice for or against national government policies. The men of Alpha recognized the alarmingly disproportionate appropriations for education of black and white citizens in many states. The Committee of Public Policy was intended to address such problems. Individually and as an organization, they worked to eliminate and overcome the barriers of segregation and prejudice, obstacles to African American development.
The architect of the whole legal attack on segregation was Charlie Houston, Charles Hamilton Houston, who saw a weakness in the laws which could be attacked through the courts.
Charles Hamilton Houston was a brilliant student, matriculating at Amherst. He was commissioned in the United States Army, going through Fort Des Moines, in essence, after a tour in Europe, where he was subjected to much racial discrimination because in the United States military he returned and entered law school at Harvard University. He became one of the charter members of Alpha Eta chapter, which was the chapter at Harvard University of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. He later came back to Washington, D.C. and was a charter member of Mu Lambda chapter. And during that time, taught at Howard University, became dean of the Howard University Law School, and became a mentor to many of the law students who later led the fight to dismantle the racial barriers in the United States, among them Thurgood Marshall.
So I remember this as a student at Fisk and as the president of Alphas at Fisk in 1934, when Charles Hamilton Houston came to Fisk University. I had the enviable pleasure of introducing him. I shall never forget his speech. That I had the passion, the commitment that he communicated to everyone who heard him. I think when Charles Houston got through, we were ready to roll up our sleeves and go out in the community and organize people, to have them to vote, to have them to participate in the drive for equality just immediately. That was our passion as a result of his being there and talking to us. And it lighted a fire in us that I think could not be extinguished in our lifetime.
Two of Charles Hamilton Houston's protégés at Howard, Alpha brothers Thurgood Marshall and Belford V. Lawson, Jr., joined Houston and other Alpha trial lawyers in arguing many of the country's major court cases affecting civil rights and civil liberties. Unavailable to address the fraternity's 1936 General Convention, Houston wrote Alpha President Charles H. Wesley to recommend Thurgood Marshall as a capable alternative. Wesley accepted this substitution, encouraging the up-and-coming young lawyer who did not disappoint. He called on Alpha brothers to support the legal battles against segregation, in which further advances were soon achieved. When Donald Murray of Baltimore was denied admission to the University of Maryland Law School on account of his race in 1935, Houston, Marshall, and Lawson filed suit to challenge his exclusion. With the support of NAACP lawyers, they argued the case successfully before the Maryland Court of Appeals, and the school was required to admit Murray. However, Murray was unable to afford books and tuition, so Alpha then stepped up to pay his costs until he graduated. The success of this case demonstrated the great potential of fighting discrimination in the courts. Continuing the momentum, Houston and Alpha brother Sidney R. Redmond sued the University of Missouri for denying fellow Alpha man Lloyd L. Gaines admission to the university's law school. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and in 1938 was decided in Gaines' favor. All Alpha men shared a great sense of pride when brother Jesse Owens rocked the world with his record-breaking gold medal performances at the 1936 Olympics. Setting the world's record and winning 4 gold medals made Owens a national hero. 2 other Alpha brothers, Ralph Metcalfe and Dave Albritton, joined Owens in winning Olympic medals for the entire world to see, including Germany's new leader, Adolf Hitler, who was heard to say, "We will next time forbid any participation of anything African."
Here you have Jesse Owens winning 4 gold medals at the 1936 Olympics and just shattering this myth of Aryan supremacy and demonstrating the ability of African Americans to compete at the highest level.
I think that we saw the demonstration of a kind of superb performance that could justify the advocacy of equality. For here was a superior type of activity on the part of an African American that proved not merely to white America, but to the world what an African American could do.
At home, Alpha Phi Alpha soon took a new focus of black electoral participation. In 1937, the fraternity launched a campaign with the motto, "A voteless people is a hopeless people." Endeavoring to gain political empowerment for African Americans through voter education, the Brothers of Alpha mounted a massive campaign. This program continues today as Alpha encourages African Americans to make their voices heard via the ballot box.
I think the program is a little bit more elevated now, a little bit more organized, but at the grassroots level, that is essentially what it is. It is going to shopping centers, it's going to populated areas, to fairs, to amusement parks, any place there's a conglomerate of individuals, and ensuring that everyone understands the responsibility of being good citizens. And you cannot be a good citizen if you are not a voting citizen.
At the outset of World War II, Alpha men embraced the opportunity to serve their country. Many African Americans served in the Second World War, but Alpha men found the segregated structure of the military frustrating and oppressive. Fascism was not the only adversary they faced.
During World War II, there was a slogan amongst African Americans that we were fighting a double V campaign for victory abroad as well as victory at home. And there was a determination that after World War II, things were going to be different, that this country could never be the same as it was before World War II. And Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity was poised to make sure that this change occurred, that this change began to take place.
When they returned from the war, African Americans found little change regarding civil rights in America. Even as they disembarked from troop ships, signs separated them from the white soldiers.
Black men who participated in World War II had their horizons expanded. They saw the world. They saw that racial segregation and discrimination was not natural, that in other countries, in France, in England, in Italy, that they were treated as equals. And they said, if this could exist amongst white people abroad, why can't this exist among white people in the United States?
Addressing this problem, Belford Lawson, elected general president of the fraternity in 1946, challenged his brothers to an even more active role in the fight for equality in America. The great decision of this generation of Alpha men is whether we shall, with every ounce of energy, with every dollar in our treasury, with every fiber of our mind and soul, deny the gigantic conspiracy to preserve our status quo and destroy the mighty, monstrous mockery of human decency and dignity.
He was one of the most eloquent and passionate advocates of the program of seeking equality of opportunity and seeking the complete enfranchisement of African Americans throughout the country. And I think that it was his passion that renewed the efforts on the part of the fraternity to achieve equality. And Lawson was, of course, he was one of the greatest orators I've ever heard, and one of the greatest advocates of social betterment that I have ever heard.
On May 17, 1942, en route from Washington, D.C. to Birmingham on the Southern Railroad, Elmer Henderson was denied dining car service and subsequently retained the services of Belford V. Lawson to challenge the railroad's segregation practices. With the financial backing of Alpha Phi Alpha and later the NAACP, the case went to the Supreme Court with Belford V. Lawson and Alpha Associate General Counsel John A. Sandifer arguing on Mr. Henderson's behalf. In 1950, the court ruled in Mr. Henderson's favor, putting an end to discrimination on America's railroads. When Alpha brother Herman Marion Sweat sought admission to the University of Texas Law School in 1946, the state of Texas set up a separate school for Sweat in a basement. In another suit, supported by Alpha Phi Alpha, the Supreme Court ruled in 1950 that African Americans could not receive an equal education in hastily assembled separate facilities, foreshadowing the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, declaring that separate was inherently unequal. Simultaneously, other Alpha brothers such as Arthur D. Shores of Birmingham, Alabama, fought diligently on the very front lines of the civil rights struggle, challenging local statutes maintaining segregation.
We called him in Alabama the Dean of Black Lawyers because at one time only he and one other lawyer were licensed to practice in the state of Alabama. He crisscrossed the state, taking cases, being a legal advocate for the black citizens of the state of Alabama in the Birmingham area and all over the state of Alabama.
Brother Frederick Douglass Patterson, president of Tuskegee Institute, spearheaded a major effort for African American higher education in 1944, pushing for the foundation of the United Negro College Fund. Of the schools originally participating in the United Negro College Fund scholarship program, the majority had presidents who were Alpha brothers. In appreciation of such tireless efforts on behalf of African Americans, the fraternity created the Alpha Award of Honor and the Alpha Award of Merit. Upon accepting the first Alpha Award of Honor, Thurgood Marshall cautioned the brothers that further struggle for freedom and equality still lay ahead. Marshall soon began work on the landmark court case Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education and enlisted fellow Alpha men for assistance.
I was teaching at Cornell, by the way, in the summer of 1953 when I got a call from, would you believe it, Thurgood Marshall. And he said, "John Hope, what are you doing this fall?" I said, "I'm going back to Howard University where I'm teaching." He said, "You know what else you'll be doing?" I said, "No." He said, "You'll be working for me." I said, "What will I be doing?" He said, "Well, you're going to be working for on the second brief in Brown against the Board of Education." I saw then what I could see at no other place, in no other point, the deep, deep commitment of Thurgood Marshall to the whole program and to finding an answer to these questions and to persuading the Supreme Court that the Constitution, that the 14th Amendment was on our side, so to speak. I've never seen a man work so hard. I've never. My father was a lawyer, and I've seen him work. And I've seen people work in other areas, but I've never seen anyone work as hard as Thurgood Marshall did in the summer and fall of 1953. And I did not know until later that his wife was dying at that time. And he sat there working day and night. I remember one night at midnight, he said, "Well, we'll take a 15-minute break." That was the most inspiring performance of duty that I've ever seen in my life by anyone. And I shall always remember that, and I shall always be humbled by it. For I then learned what real sacrifice, what real devotion, what real commitment, what real passion can be and can bring about.
These tireless efforts in the courts led to continuing progress that forever altered American life.
Dramatic news as the United States Supreme Court rules in the school segregation case of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education.
On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Brown, and African Americans across the country rejoiced. While the Brown decision was a victory against segregation, the implementation and enforcement of the ruling was a different story.
Education facilities are inherently unequal.
I remember so well On May the 17th, 1954, my wife, who was the librarian at Spingarn High School here in Washington, and I was at Howard University, my wife called me on the afternoon of the 17th of May, and she said, "Have you heard the news?" I said, "What news?" She said, "The Supreme Court decision." I said, "No." She said, "We won." And, of course, I was immensely pleased, delighted. Then I learned that the entire country was reacting. Those people who were promoting desegregation were happy about it and elated. But I also realized, even on that afternoon, and particularly that night and the next day, that while some people celebrated the 14th Amendment, there were others who were decrying the decision, expressing disappointment, and expressing determination to nullify that opinion, regardless of what it took.
The Southern reaction was often ugly, sometimes violent. Students, parents, and elected officials refused to abide by the Brown ruling, forcing federal intervention. But the push forward continued and increased momentum in coming years.
Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, of course, is involved in the struggle that begins in the South, that spreads across the country, that starts with December 1st, 1955, when a courageous black woman decided that she'd had enough. Not that she was just tired. She was tired, all right. She was tired of being treated as a second-class citizen.
The Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott seized the country's attention and thrust Alpha brother Martin Luther King Jr. to national prominence as a civil rights crusader. Son of an Atlanta preacher, Martin Luther King Jr. was a newcomer to Montgomery, having recently earned his Ph.D. at Boston University, where he was a member of Alpha's Sigma chapter.
In Montgomery, here you have this young minister just out of graduate school. Family has just had a child. He's called upon to lead this movement. Now, we look back today, and of course, we honor Martin Luther King Jr. as a tremendous leader, but that was a thankless job. Very few people wanted that position because it meant that they were going to be the focus of attention. And as Martin Luther King's house was bombed, his life was threatened, the lives of his family, this was not a position that people were running to become the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. But Martin Luther King Jr., I think through his family, in many respects through the fraternity, was prepared.
Very proud of that. But it was a necessity. It came about because that was the way it was. My father told me that if you pay more than 25% of your rent of your income rather for rent, that you can't afford to live in that particular rental unit. So I introduced legislation to put a maximum that no one living in public housing would pay more than 25% of their income for rent. It was called the Brooke Amendment. I'm proud of that.
The Brooke Amendment dictates that public housing tenants pay no more than 25% of their income on rent and mandates government subsidy. Howard University, site of Alpha's first General Convention many decades before, proudly hosted the World Policy Council members at their initial meeting after the group's formation.
Well, several years ago, the organization founded the World Policy Council here at the university. The first meeting, organizational meeting, was held here at Howard, and Senator Brooke and President Ponder and a number of others, Ambassador Horace Dawson, and many others were part of that founding. And I think it's a natural outgrowth, and it's a very mature and sophisticated response to global and world issues that really affect us all, and it's a recognition of that.
We work with men in that policy board. We talk, we think, it's like a think tank, and then we try to project what we think ought to happen, how we think the values that are consistent with the values of Alpha, and consistent with the values of an international leader like Martin Luther King Jr., who of course was an Alpha. To me, that is one of the cutting-edge ventures for Alpha, that we learn how to use the global platform to talk about local issues as well.
Our job, I think, is to do reflection, dialogue, research, and to reflect on major social and political issues, as well as religious matters.
After considerable discussion and reflection, we draw up and issue papers, position papers, on these.
To emerge with an enriched experience, revitalized with the teachings and spirit of one of the 20th century's most influential men. While Dr. King will forever be treasured by his brothers in Alpha, he is but one Alpha man who excelled in his service to all humanity. In the last century,